Say hello in the chat and let us know where you are calling from. And if you have any questions for the author, please put them in the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to that as soon as we can. Let me tell you a little bit about Eyeseeme. My parents, Jeffrey and Pamela Blair, started Eyeseeme Eyeseeme African American Children's Bookstore based on their experience raising their four brilliant and beautiful children, me included. We found it incredibly difficult finding books that reflected us, our beauty, our brown skin, and the majesty of our kinky hair, and the significant contributions of our ancestors to society and the building of this nation. So they spent a substantial amount of time curating our collection of books in all subjects so they could feed us positive understanding about ourselves. So long story short, with this foundation of our identity, we were self-motivated about learning and did exceptionally well in school. They would get questions from other parents and teachers about us, and they would tell them the most important thing is that they let us see ourselves in the books that we read. Thus, we opened the doors of Eyeseeme on Juneteenth in 2015 in University City, Missouri. And our mission is to be a resource to parents, teachers, and schools in providing the very best children's books on the market that promote positive images and stories about African American culture and history. As a tool to help increase literacy, African American children will benefit by seeing themselves respectfully represented in the literature they read. And non-African American children will benefit by helping to dispel negative and inaccurate stereotypical images of people of color, and that despite our many differences, all people share common feelings and aspirations. Okay, and I am honored to welcome our esteemed guest of today, Ms. Carole Boston Weatherford, and we'll be highlighting her new book, Unspeakable, The Tulsa Race Massacre, and I have the book right here. It is illustrated by Floyd Cooper and published by Carole Rhoda Books, a learner publishing group imprint. And I will start really quickly by letting you guys know a little bit about Ms. Weatherford. Hailed by Huffington Post as a master of picture book nonfiction, Carole Boston Weatherford is a Newbery Honor author, New York Times bestseller, and a two-time NAACP Image Award winner. Since her 1995 debut, she has published 50 plus books, including these Caldecott Honor winners: Freedom in Congo Square, Voice of Freedom, Fannie Lou Hamer, Spirit of the Civil Rights Movement, and Moses, When Harriet Tubman Led Her People to Freedom. 6 of her books have won Coretta Scott King Awards or honors. Her words stand as monuments to icons and unsung heroes alike. Growing up, Carole found few Black characters in books, but when she became a mother, she discovered a new crop of diverse books. Inspired, she shifted from writing for adults to creating children's literature. Family stories, fading traditions, and forgotten struggles inform her poetry, nonfiction, and historical fiction. With an MFA in creative writing from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and an MA in publications design from the University of Baltimore, Carole is a professor at Fayetteville State University in North Carolina. Her career achievements have been recognized with the Nonfiction Award from the Children's Book Guild, the North Carolina Literature Award, and the Reagan Rubin Award from North Carolina English Teachers Association, and a place in the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame. She's a lifetime member of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Thank you so much for being here. And I just want to start out by saying it is such an honor to have you here, and how inspiring it is that you use your writing powers for good by creating stories that show our beautiful Black heritage. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in this morning, afternoon here. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself before I get into Unspeakable. I have ridden a camel. That's the first thing you need to know about me. I was afraid to sit up front, so that's my son. I would never have gotten on the camel's back had he not been there. I made up my first poem when I was in first grade. I dictated it to my mother on the way home from school. My dad was a high school printing teacher, and he had printing presses right in his classroom. So I was able to see my work in print at a very early age because my dad used my poems as early poems as typesetting exercises for my students. But I did not get published until many years later. I did not know that being an author was a career. I loved books as a child, but I had no idea that the people who were writing those books were, number one, alive, and number two, getting paid to write books. So that career was just not even within my realm of possibility growing up. But I did love to read. These are some of the books that I enjoyed reading as a girl. A few of them are diverse books. There's a much different uh, array of books that my kids had access to in the 90s than I had access to in the 60s. Nevertheless, I did find some books with African American characters every now and then. But it was like more like every once in a blue moon. I've got more than 50 books, and Naomi did talk about some of the honors that my books have received. And boys and girls, if you go to libraries and even your school library, or you've read a lot of books, you know that some books, you can tell award-winning books sometimes because those books have stickers on them, medals on them. So you can see that my books have several medals, and these medals are all from different divisions of the American Library Association. But not all awards, not all book awards have shiny stickers. Sometimes you get a trophy, like the glass trophy, glass flame that you see on the left. Sometimes you get a little cup, looks like a bowl actually, but it's a little cup that you see on the top right. Sometimes you get a big heavy statue, like the NAACP Image Award in the bottom right. But I'm going to tell you, the reason I'm really showing you this slide is because I wanted you to see the creepiest award that I've ever gotten. The creepiest award that I've ever gotten, and I do appreciate the award, but the prize is still creepy, is Jane Addams of the Jane Addams Children's Literature Honor. And this doll came in the mail after I got the award with this little medal on the doll. Anyway, to me, I don't know about you boys and girls, but to me, it looks like the kind of doll that would come alive in the middle of the night and you'd wake up and the doll is standing on your pillow. So I keep her way up high where she can't get me. My first children's book came out in 1995. It was Juneteenth Jamboree, about the first African-American holiday, Juneteenth, which stands for June 19th, 1865, the date in U.S. history when the last enslaved people were freed. And if you want to know more about that story, you can read Juneteenth Jamboree. One of my favorite books that I have written is Becoming Billie Holiday. And that is about my muse, the jazz singer, Billie Holiday. She really inspires me, and she grew up in the same city that I did, Baltimore, Maryland. So I'm going to shift now to Unspeakable. But I did want to tell you, parents, Unspeakable is about the Tulsa Race Massacre. There is not, anything graphic in the telling of the story, but the story is meant to be discussed afterwards between parent and child. So I hope you will discuss the book afterwards with your children. Bear with me, folks. All right, so Unspeakable is set in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The book is illustrated by Floyd Cooper. The year that the main event in the book takes place is 1921. But just to give you an idea of what Tulsa was at that time, in the early 1900s, the Greenwood district of Tulsa was home to a thriving African-American community. 10,000 people lived in a 35 square block area. And this is more for the grown-ups than the children. The economic loss resulting from property damage and people being dislocated as a result of the massacre, would be, is estimated at $200 million in today's dollars. So that's almost like a hurricane, the type of numbers you would see from hurricane losses up and down the US coast in the 1950s or 1960s. So that, that kind of allows you to wrap your head around, the kind of damage that did take place. So I'm going to go ahead and read the book now. Floyd Cooper creates art through what is known as a subtractive technique, and he paints with oil, and then he goes back with an eraser and begins to, I guess, reveal the image to himself, and then he adds more paint later. And he is a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Once upon a time near Tulsa, prospectors struck it rich in the oil fields. The wealth created jobs, raised buildings, and attracted newcomers from far and wide, seeking fortune and a fresh start. Once upon a time in Tulsa, there was a community called Greenwood. The residents descended from Black Indians, from formerly enslaved people, and from exodusters who moved west in the late 1800s, fleeing the violence and racism of the segregated South. And that girl is holding what's known as a corn husk doll. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were some 10,000 people living in a 35 square block area. Train tracks divided the Black and white communities. Segregation laws called for separate neighborhoods, schools, phone booths, and railroad and streetcar coaches. Unfair tests made it hard for Blacks to register to vote, and laws barred marriages across racial lines. So many Black businesses cropped up along a 1-mile stretch of Greenwood Avenue that educator and business leader Booker T. Washington called the area the Negro Wall Street of America. The name later became Black Wall Street, and the community kept thriving. Once upon a time on Black Wall Street, there were dozens of restaurants and grocery stores. There were furriers, a pool hall, a bus system, and an auto shop. Nearly 200 businesses in all. There were also several libraries, a hospital, a post office, and a separate school system, where some say Black children got a better education than whites. There were 2 Black-owned newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun, and over 20 churches, and 15 Black doctors, including Dr. A.C. Jackson, the most able Black surgeon in the nation. On Detroit Avenue stood grand homes of doctors, lawyers, and prominent businessmen. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were barbershops and beauty salons. Miss Mabel's Little Rose Beauty Salon boomed on Thursdays when maids who worked for white families got coiffed on their day off and strutted in style up and down Greenwood Avenue. The soda fountain at Williams Confectionery was the backdrop for scores of marriage proposals. And there was the luxurious Stratford Hotel, then the largest Black-owned hotel in the nation. Black guests were welcome there, even as they were barred from Tulsa's white hotels. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were 2 movie theaters, including the 800-seat Black-owned Dreamland. There were even 6 privately owned airplanes. But in 1921, not everyone in Tulsa was pleased with these signs of Black wealth, undeniable proof that African Americans could achieve just as much, if not more, than whites. All it took was one elevator ride, one 17-year-old white elevator operator accusing a 19-year-old Black shoeshine man of assault for simmering hatred to boil over. With the accused man in jail, the white-owned Tulsa Tribune newspaper ran a headline prompting readers to nab him. Fearing the man would be lynched, killed by a mob before his trial, 30 armed Black men rushed downtown to his rescue. At the jail, they faced off with 2,000 armed whites. On May 31st, 1921, one day after Memorial Day, a holiday honoring fallen soldiers, skirmishes between the 2 groups left 2 Black men and 10 white men dead. But the worst was yet to come. Unable to get the jailed suspect, the white mob sparked rumors that the Black community planned to attack. Unchecked and in some cases deputized by the police, the white mob stormed into Greenwood, looting and burning homes and businesses that Blacks had saved and sacrificed to build. Threatening to shoot, the mob blocked firefighters from putting out the blazes. African American World War I veterans took up arms to defend their families and property, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Once upon a time in Greenwood, up to 300 Black people, including Dr. Jackson, were killed. Hundreds more were injured. More than 8,000 people were left homeless, and hundreds of businesses and other establishments were reduced to ash. The police did nothing to protect the Black community. When the National Guard arrived the next day, all that was left to do was put out fires and move thousands of Black residents into camps outside of Tulsa. As their community lay in ruins, Black residents had to carry passes to enter the city. In the days and weeks that followed, some Black Tulsans left and never returned. Others stayed and rebuilt the Greenwood community only to witness its decline in the 1960s. For decades, survivors did not speak of the terror. 75 years passed before lawmakers launched an investigation to uncover the painful truth about the worst racial attack in United States history. Police and city officials had plotted with the white mob to destroy the nation's wealthiest Black community. Today, Tulsa's Reconciliation Park remembers victims of the 1921 massacre and recalls the role of African Americans in Oklahoma history. But the park is not just a bronze monument to the past. It is a place to realize the responsibility we all have to reject hatred and violence and to instead choose hope. So that is Unspeakable, the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I just wanted to point out to you this picture right here. That is Floyd Cooper's grandfather. And I did not know when I asked Floyd if he would illustrate, if he would be willing to illustrate this project. It was then in draft stage, a work in progress. I did not know when I approached him about illustrating this that his grandfather had actually survived the massacre. His grandfather was a teenager at the time. And these two photos here are photos of Reconciliation Park in Tulsa. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now. And I guess we'll open up for discussion.
Yes, thank you for reading your book. It is such a detailed and really rounded story about Black Wall Street. We get details that, other than, oh, it was just Black Wall Street, we get the number of businesses, the types of people that were there. And this story is such a great story to tell of Black Wall Street itself, and it's such, and even the massacre tells a story of um, of how people fought back at Black excellence. So what does this story mean to you? And why did you choose to write it at this moment? Like, why did you choose to have this be your next topic to write about in 2020, 2021?
Yeah, well, it probably would have been like 2018. And I was deciding. So first of all, when I decided, I did not realize that 2021 was going to be the 100th anniversary. I wasn't writing to time it for the anniversary. It was a topic that I had been interested in for a while. I have, kind of an idea file, and I'm interested in social justice things. I had written about hate violence before. I wrote about the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, 1963. So I'd written about this type of topic before. I'd written about, police brutality before in Fannie Lou Hamer, my Fannie Lou Hamer book. And of course, I had written about the brutality of slavery. So it's just part of my mission to document the history of African American people, and not just not just the achievements. The fact that we're still here, that itself is an achievement, but not just that, not just the the wonderful achievements and the way we've overcome, but also what we've had to overcome. And so this is, of course, the race massacre is one of the, it's a symbol now of the type of violence, the hate violence that we have had to confront at various points in our history. And most importantly, I wanted to show that these incidents are not anomalies. They are part of a continuum that, started, during the slavery era and continues to this day in, in Ferguson, in, I don't even have to name all the places. I'd be going all over the United States, but nor do I need to name the victims, but we know who they are, and we know that this type of violence continues. It may not be on the scale of the massacre, but the potential for white supremacist violence, is still high, and we know this.
Mhm. And you're talking about these very true, very detailed stories about brutality, about violence, about the real lives of slaves. And I know many parents or educators might say, oh, this is too truthful, too violent, too harsh to be in children's books or for children to learn about. What would you say to parents and educators that do say that?
Okay, well, that question is, kind of boil the question down. Are kids too tender for tough topics? My answer is no. If children were not too tender to be, taken into the fields at age 5 or 6 when they were enslaved, if kids are not too tender to be, gunned down within seconds by a police officer, today, if Emmett Till was not, he was 14, he was 17, but he was still a child. If kids are not too tender to be victimized by hate violence and by racial oppression, social injustice, then kids are not too young to learn about it.
Mhm.
So as long as kids are victimized by these things, these evils, I think it's, we have to inform kids, particularly African American children, so they can understand, and not just African American children. It needs to be documented for what it is, so that children can recognize it when they see it, and you can't all of a sudden tell them, oh no, these are patriots.
Mhm.
That's not what patriotism is.
Right. And I especially didn't get that type of education in the schools that I went to. Telling the truthful history, whether it is about slavery or
None
even
of us have, because it's not
right,
available.
right,
It's largely unavailable. You might find that an African American. There were some Afrocentric rather, charter schools, or that may have had a curriculum that uh, would include some of these things, but so much of our history has been omitted, quite intentionally omitted, whitewashed, and this is within the curriculum, misconstrued, twisted, that parents really have to supplement. And well, first of all, so much has been left out that it would take teachers a lifetime to catch us up. You know, there isn't that time in the classroom. There isn't time to cover all of American history. Not that this is not American history, it is, and it should be included in the curriculum. But there isn't, there aren't hours in the day. They're not devoting, the time that they used to in school to the study of civics at all at a time like this, when political participation is more important than ever. But the teachers have so many demands on them with curriculum and state standards, that parents really do have to supplement, and that's where bookstores like Eyeseeme come in, where parents can buy those books for their homes, and certainly public libraries have a big part to play too. And if your library doesn't have books like these, tell them they need to get them. That's how they make their shopping list, by what people request.
And before I get to the next question, I want to remind everyone to put all questions in the Q&A portion. We would love to hear your questions, any questions you have for Ms. Weatherford, or anything about our discussion that we have today.
Somebody asked, what can we do to teach our history as part of the total curriculum? And I may have addressed part of that. I mean, I think you need to attend school board meetings, but a lot of these decisions don't necessarily get made by local school boards. Sometimes those decisions are made at the state level as to what the curriculum is going to be. So you just have to get inside of that system and just make your voice heard if you can. But it will take more than one parent. That's yeah.
Um, and you touched on this a little bit before. I don't know if you completely answered this question. And we're talking about the benefit of having this in schools. And of course, it's going to be beneficial for Black students to learn about their own history, whether it was something like this massacre or any sort of violence, as well as the many achievements that we've had in our history. What benefits would you say this has to people that are not of color, people that this isn't part of like their people's heritage, as far as who might say, oh, this isn't my history. What would you say, or how would you say that impacts people that are not of color, whether
Well,
it's students or
I think that when people hear a story, they're not necessarily thinking, in racial terms. If a story connects with them, and at some if they hear a story and it connects with them on some level, it becomes their history. So, and that goes for any story, whether it's true or a fictional story. If you read something, whether it's about somebody who looks like you or somebody who doesn't look like you, once you take that information in, it becomes part of you on some level. So, the part of you that is memory, that is history. So, I think it's important for all kids to uh, have access to diverse books and hear stories about kids that look like them, and hear stories about people who may not look like them. Because the whole world, people around the world do not look, we do not all look alike. But yet there are some universal themes and some universal values and universal aspirations that we all share. And so, when they read stories like this, it helps to cultivate empathy. And empathy is central to living on this planet together.
mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
to being a fully functioning member of society, or even of a family. You've got to have empathy and humanity.
Um, and yeah, no, I completely agree. I know I went to a mostly white middle school, high school. I'm now in a mostly white college, and the hearing people that haven't had that opportunity to hear about histories other than their own, whether it was through their parents teaching them or the education they got from any school they went to, and they're lacking that empathy, that connection with people outside of their bubble, racial or socioeconomic or otherwise. And so I completely agree with you.
And they're not very well rounded either.
Right,
If
exactly.
they're culturally illiterate,
Mhm.
they're not very well rounded. You can't be culturally literate, and only know about the people who came from Italy
Yeah.
to the United States, or even, wonderful as we are, even just knowing about Black people. We could not function in this society if we only knew about Black people.
Right.
So, they need to learn, they need to, get some of these skills that we have to adapt. I mean, because if nothing else, our achievement having been able to adapt,
Mhm.
and to continue to be able to adapt and to navigate these obstacles that are, continually placed in our way. So we have had to become very savvy and have had to know their story, their history, but they need to learn ours.
Mhm. And there are a couple questions about um, this being taught in schools or school curriculums. And I will say that in Eyeseeme, I do believe, and I think this is shown, that this does start young, whether it's starting in children's books like this and incorporating that into a curriculum. But how would you say, and how would you approach um, having topics of race, whether it's race violence or talking about achievements that aren't actually taught about in schools now, and putting that into a curriculum? And maybe even how young of an age would you start?
Well, it, depends on, we're talking about, if we're talking about nonfiction, I guess let's talk about nonfiction. Well, I think nonfiction, you can probably start nonfiction of maybe of a historical nature pretty young. You can almost start at 3. Telling a kid about a role model like an Aretha Franklin behind me. There are books nonfiction books in, every genre, um, nonfiction, biography, uh, fantasy, sci-fi, for just about all ages. So you might find a little kid book about a robot, even for babies, you might find a book about a talking robot or a dragon that dances. That's fantasy, but
Mhm.
it's not the same level of fantasy as Game of Thrones, you
Right.
know. So, there are books that teachers can access and share in the classroom, uh, with various, for various age levels. I have a list of my books, in which I have, checked them off like by grade level, and also, by curriculum area, which curriculum area they connect with. Uh, so the books are there, and I think that, if we may not be able to get a whole curriculum, a whole, everything we want in terms of curriculum, but individual teachers, individual librarians can, do a lot to make these books available and to use the books in their classrooms,
Mhm.
perhaps to supplement a unit, on civil rights. Maybe they would read, my book Freedom on the Menu, the Greensboro Sit-ins, or Respect, about Aretha Franklin, might get used in a music classroom. My books about jazz artists and other musicians. The Roots of Rap. I saw you had that behind you. That again has been used in music classrooms.
Right.
So
Right.
there are lots of opportunities. We may lack time, but when we lack time, we have to have, that's where our will comes in.
Mhm.
And if you have a will, then you will find a way. Somebody asked me how much time do I spend a day writing? Not enough. I also have a day job as a professor, college professor, at Fayetteville State University. It's an HBCU in North Carolina. So my time is divided between, my literary career, which is my first love, and my academic career, which is my day job. So not enough. I try to write every day, but that doesn't always happen.
And in writing this book, Unspeakable, what was the process like? Did you, what was that maybe inciting incident or moment where you're like, okay, I'm going to write this book next? And what was that?
Okay, I was literally at, I used to write, on the road quite a bit, particularly like in airports or on planes or hotel rooms, when I'm traveling alone. So I was at a conference, the, National Conference of Teachers of English, and it's in Houston. And I think I was having lunch with some people, and Tulsa came up, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to write about that." And that was it. I decided that I started it that weekend. Uh, Not only contacted, the illustrator, shared with him the the manuscript when it was still a draft, but I also met with the editor, at that conference, and it was really strange because I was thinking, wow, I want to, meet with her, but I'm not that good with faces. I may know people's names from emailing, but I'm not that good with faces. And the more people in a place, the less likely I am to recognize somebody, right? So this is at a convention, and I thought, well, if I go to a booth, I may not even know, who she is, and I'd love to just share this with her. But lo and behold, she came to breakfast that morning and came over to me and said, "Do you mind if I sit at your table?" It still hadn't dawned on me that it was her. And she sat down and, wow, isn't that something? So she sat down and had breakfast with me, and I told her about the project, and she was, interested from the start. And of course, 3 years later, here it is. See, I see another question. What about teaching the community? Okay. Should we have town halls and bring petitions? Yeah, sure. That would be great. Bring petitions, to, school boards. Uh, I don't know how, state departments of education work, but those people are elected, sometimes. Some of the people who are state superintendents are elected. In North Carolina, it's an elected official. So yeah, again, political activism comes in. School board members are usually elected. So again, activism comes in, attending some, community engagement, civic engagement comes in, like I said, going through the school board meetings, writing letters, petitions are good. What about teaching the community about the Schomburg Library? which already has. Yeah, you're right, there are many repositories, and not just the Schomburg Library, many libraries. Even some, municipal library systems or county library systems sometimes have an archive. There's not a lot of money available for libraries to develop digital archives or digital collections. And so those can be a very rich source of resources to teach your kids about African American history. Library of Congress is one of those national archives. But I would say definitely, I mean, those places are like a gold mine when it comes to primary source materials. They can actually look at photographs from time periods, about various historical events, and can be very, very interesting.
And learning about this specific event, whether it was Black Wall Street itself or the massacre, and researching yourself, how was that process? How long did that take? And is there maybe one interesting tidbit or interesting thing that you found in your research that you were surprised about?
It didn't take that long, to be honest. Maybe I may have worked on it off and on for about a month after I did the draft. It's essentially a poem and a story, and it's a story. And once I decided that I was going to use, the familiar, fairy tale, Once Upon a Time, it kind of flowed from there. I didn't, it's not like I took a forensic approach, first of all. In researching what Black Wall Street was like before the massacre, and because I wanted to recreate that community. And you may have noticed that I spent about 2/3 of the book talking about what a great place Black Wall Street had been, economically, and in terms of the Black achievement nationwide. So I wanted to do that, to recreate Black Wall Street in its heyday. So that required, research. I had to research that, the names of names of stores, names of businesses, how many people lived there, how big was the area, because I wanted to get that detail. And then, of course, I had to document the incident itself. And I had to figure out, okay, how am I going to document this horrible, violent incident for kids? And so I didn't focus on individual losses, but instead focus on the collective losses, because I think the individual losses would have been, much, much more painful for a kid to get attached to a character, and then they have these characters die, in the process. So so I took that approach, a very a forensic approach, and indeed it was a crime. So that was, all the more reason to have taken a forensic approach. Oh, did I research the writings? I did. I do remember. I used the report of the commission, the state in 1996. The state state of Oklahoma, I'm sorry, issued a report on the Tulsa Race Massacre, and they, tried to arrive at, how many people had been killed, how many people had been left homeless, what the damage was. And so that was a very detailed report. And I relied on that. I relied on materials from the local library there, from the Greenwood Cultural Association, and from the Tulsa and Oklahoma historical societies. So among those would have been some firsthand, among the things that I read would have been some firsthand accounts or quotes from survivors. So yes, I did. I didn't interview survivors, but I did, because most of them were dead. But I did, consult their words, and I consider this book in a way giving them voice, because most of their voices were never heard, and the losses were never really measured. And in fact, we've been talking about curriculum. The state of Oklahoma didn't even teach this as part of the curriculum until the 20th century. So, if the state of Oklahoma doesn't even teach, you can imagine what other school systems are not teaching it, or how they might be teaching it if they are.
Yeah. And in talking about research and the planning that goes into a book, like you were saying before, what is the process like generally? Because you have a lot of books that are real, true, actual stories about what's happened in history for children. And so how does that research goes and that planning? And how do you pick?
Yeah, and a lot of times it depend. It can depend on the topic. It can depend on um, how much there is to find. If a person, if I'm writing about a person that has been written about, has had many biographies written about them, then there's a lot of, I can do a lot of research because there are going to be a lot of, a lot of things like Harriet Tubman. A lot of things have been published about Harriet Tubman. Fannie Lou Hamer, fewer things have been published about Fannie Lou Hamer. Henry Box Brown, who you see behind me, not so much written about Henry Box Brown. So, that research is different than researching somebody like Harriet Tubman, whose life has been, like stories been told many, many times before, or somebody like Aretha Franklin, who was a public figure at a time when, every aspect of a person's life could be documented in the media. So, yeah, and then also with Aretha Franklin, I actually was a fan. I grew up listening to her music, so I had more of a familiarity with her than I did, with someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who died when before I was a teenager, or Henry Box Brown, who was enslaved. So I had no idea what his life might have been like. So it just varies from project to project, but usually I try to use both primary sources when I can, but I'm not shy about consulting secondary sources. A big part of my research is always picture research, because as an author, and particularly as a poet, I like to be able to paint a picture for my readers. Even though my books are going to be illustrated, I want to paint a picture, and the pictures that I paint then should evoke some images in the mind, not only of the reader, but in the mind of the illustrator, so the illustrator can envision what the illustrations are going to look like. So picture research is always a big part of what I do. And I go to places like the Library of Congress, the Schomburg Center, Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, National Archives, military museums. I go to museums as well to do research. And a lot of times I can do that virtually now.
There is a question saying, in your research, have you come across any documentation of everyday lives of Black pioneers? I'm thinking along the lines of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And they commented, it is exciting to now have many more books available to share that reflect the lives of students and the families I serve.
I think that Floyd Cooper actually illustrated a book like that, and it's called I Have Heard of a Land. If the person's talking about children's books, and that is about, I think it's about exodusters. The author, Floyd, and I think the author as well, hail from Oklahoma.
Okay.
So there are some books like that. Someone asked me, did I research the writings of actual survivors of the tragedy? I think we talked about that. Was it hard to find companies to publish your books of poetry? Yes, at the beginning and in the middle. I'm established now, not as hard. Everything I write though does not get published. Some things are, still on my drive on my computer, and I can't find a publisher for everything that I write. Would be nice. They don't know that what a big mistake they're making, passing on these manuscripts.
And even speaking about writing and your writing career in general, do you remember the exact moment or time in your life where you're like, I want to be a writer, or even specifically, I want to be a writer of children's books or adult books?
Yeah, I do. I wrote, as I said, for many years, but it did not aspire to be an author until I was in my 20s. And that was when I had a poem published by someone other than my father. Remember, I said he had a printing press in his classroom, and a poem published someplace other than a school literary magazine, newspaper, or literary, journal. So I had a poem published in a now defunct city magazine in Baltimore, Maryland. That's where I grew up. The poem was called "I'm Made of Jazz." At the time, it was the longest poem I had ever written, and it appeared in this magazine. And when I saw that poem in print, oh boy, I started telling people I was a poet, and I got it in my head that I was going to be a published author. It took about 14 more years for that to happen. And I decided that I wanted to write for children when I became a mother. I was writing poetry for adults up until then, and writing as a journalist, so writing for newspapers and magazines. So once I became a mother, I started sharing books with my own children, and I noticed that there were a lot more diverse books for them than there had been for me, and that it dawned on me that maybe I could try writing for children. And of course, try I have, and I'm still trying. Do we have Black-owned publishers? Yes, Just Us Books.
Mm-hmm.
Just Us Books. They're out of New Jersey, and they've been in business, I think, 30 years, maybe. They publish Afrobets. My kids read in fact, those were some of the diverse books that I read to my kids. Afrobets, ABCs, Afrobets 1, 2, 3s, Bright Eyes, Brown Skin. Those are the books that they had published that I read to my kids. They have many, many more books now. Mm-hmm. I have one book with them called Sink or Swim: African American Lifesavers of the Outer Banks.
Oh yes, we use Just Us Books too. We love them. Yes.
Yeah, they talk, and they have the We Rise, We Resist, We Raise Our Voices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And talking about your writing, and you talking before about your poetry and how you were writing your poetry, and you said in an interview one time with Sonja Cherry Paul of the Black Creator Series that you call your genre a hybrid genre,
right,
poetry and history. So how did your writing develop and evolve to become this hybrid? And what advice would you give to someone trying to write in this similar way?
It evolved into that, I guess, just kind of naturally because of my own curiosity and my own interest. My interest is in historical subject matter. My interest was in writing nonfiction, but the voice that I had honed up to that point was a poetic voice, because poetry was my first literary language. And so I just decided I was going to write about these things, jazz and Aretha Franklin and Harriet Tubman and Fannie Hamer and on and on. I was going to write about them, but I was going to do so through poetry. So it just kind of came, it was organic. I didn't just say, okay, I'm going to do hybrid genre work. No, I was doing hybrid genre work. And then I realized that I was doing hybrid genre work. I think I saw the word hybrid genre somewhere. I said, oh yeah, that's what I do. So, it wasn't, anything intentional in terms of, like learning the term hybrid genre, and then I'm going to write this kind of stuff. And I already was. So, it just happened like that. What hybrid genre work is Aretha Franklin is a biography. It's a true story about a real person's life, or a true story from a real person's life. Doesn't have to be their whole life story. But the way I tell the story is through poetry. Unspeakable is about a true incident, but I wrote it as a poem. Box is a verse biography. It's a biography, of Henry Box Brown, but it is told through a series of poems, just the same way that Voice of Freedom, the book about Fannie Hamer, is told. So, that's just what I do. It's just what I do. That may be my hallmark. Would I consider a book on Ida B. Wells? I actually have a friend who was going to write about her, and I think because the friend is white, and because of own voices, she passed the project and her research, a big old envelope, to me. So yes, I am supposed to be working on a book about Ida B. Wells.
And there's a question saying, what factor or factors stood out to you during your research about Black Wall Street? And also, have you considered writing about the East St. Louis War in 1917? There,
Actually, on the second part of the question, I actually have a work in progress now that is that deals with that in part. East St. Louis, yes. So yes, and the other part of the question is what stood out? Well, I think one of the not this is not one of the things that's in the book per se. A couple things. One that there was these privately owned airplanes. And I think that's one thing that always stood out to me. This fact that these people had some of these people had so much money that they had their own airplanes. And granted, this was a time when most Americans didn't even have cars. Some didn't even have horses and buggies, but some of these folks had airplanes. So that stood out to me, that level of achievement. The other thing that has stood out to me, and it's not in the book anymore, in the text anymore, is the fact that according to African American lore in the area, among survivors and eyewitnesses, there were airplanes involved in dropping bombs on Greenwood. Now that fact has been widely debated and contested, and in the end, my editor asked me to leave that out because it said that there were airplanes, but they're not really sure if they dropped bombs, if they helped to fuel the fire. So I don't have that in there, but that of course struck me, the fact that these planes were used, and just the lengths to which white supremacists will go when they are confronted with the threat of Black advancement. So that, above all, that is what struck me. It's not any one thing. If there's one detail in the book, it was the page of Miss Mabel's Rose's Beauty Salon or something. That spread, just how routine things were, and how just bustling things were before tragedy struck that day.
and as we are winding down our conversation, I just have a couple of questions about you personally, such as who is your favorite author and what book are you reading right now?
Who's my favorite author? I'll say, yeah, I'm not sure I have a favorite. Langston Hughes. That's what I usually say, because he's the author that has been with me the longest. I was introduced to his poetry when I was in elementary school, and considered him a mentor, a literary mentor. Now, I never met him or anything, but I would have to say Langston Hughes is a favorite poet. If I have a favorite poem, it is Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. And if I had to name a poem that has had the most impact on me, it is by neither of those poets. It is Incident by County Cullen, which is set in Baltimore, my hometown.
It's funny you say Langston Hughes. That was also my favorite author. My parents gave me his book when I was just starting reading about poetry and writing poetry when I was in elementary school as well. So
yeah, definitely a master.
Yes.
And I've got a story about his ghost as well. I was in, some people mentioned my book Schomburg. I was in New York. Didn't have anything to do with Schomburg, but I was up there for the Roots of Rap book launch, and I was in the Langston Hughes house. And I was standing at the mantle posing for a photograph with the illustrator, Frank Morrison. And we were standing in front of this painting that Frank had donated to the Langston Hughes house, of Langston Hughes. And there was a Langston Hughes' actual typewriter, manual typewriter was on the mantle. And I looked at Frank and I looked at the person who was hosting the event. I said, "Do you think this place could be haunted?" And they just kind of chuckled, "No, no, no, no." And it's kind of drafty because the place was on a tight budget and it was winter time, January in New York. And so we're sitting down and we're being introduced, and we each had a bottle of water, and my water was on the stool. You know, the place was it was not windy. Nobody was moving. You know, just somebody's voice. And my water bottle got knocked off the stool somehow. And I said, "Hey, Langston is here." So that's my ghost story.
A little scary. um, um, I did have a question actually, and even going back to talking about, and this will be one of our last questions. So if you have any last remaining questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Do you think there will ever be another Black Wall Street?
It won't look like it looks now. I don't know. You know, I don't know what the future holds. If there is one, it may be in cyberspace. I don't know. You know, I think that um, perhaps even by necessity, they say necessity is the mother of invention. A lot of young people are extremely entrepreneurial. Um, a lot of their entrepreneurism is taking place, you know, via e-commerce and that kind of thing. So it may not look like the Black Wall Street of the past, but I do think that there, you know, as more and more young people gain the skills and see other people who look like them succeeding as entrepreneurs, they will decide to go that route. And you know, of course, there aren't the number of jobs that there used to be. So many people are working in the gig economy now. So that has made people entrepreneurial too, so that they can develop multiple revenue streams, as they call it. So yeah, I mean, it may not look like Black Wall Street did back then. Real estate is not cheap.
Right, right.
Yeah. Once you lose it, it's hard to get it back.
Yeah, yep, definitely. But it's such a great story to tell. I definitely, even maybe as not the intended audience, I definitely enjoyed reading your book and the poetry to it. And so I thank you for writing it and for writing many of your other books as well. And I can't wait to read your next piece. I want to thank you for being here. Thank our audience for being here as well. Please know that you can buy this book on the Eyeseeme website at eyeseeme.com or come to a brick and mortar in University City, Missouri, as well as many of our other books. So I want to thank you for being here again. And I'm excited to see everyone at our next Eyeseeme Spotlight series. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.